We are standing on the Aventine, which is the lowest of the 7 hills of Rome. Over there we see the Capitoline Hill. The city that became Rome started as a group of small settlements clustered on the tops of these 7 hills. At the foot of the hill here, in Roman times, was the port of the city. So trade, grain and other commodities were brought up from the port of Ostia on the Mediterranean by barge along the river Tiber and discharged their cargoes here at the foot of the hill. So the neighbouring hill, the Aventine, became a centre for traders, for immigrants, and also for systems of foreign worship. Amongst these was Christianity. By the time of the sack of Rome, the Aventine had become a wealthy quarter. So it suffered badly during the sack of Rome. But a few years later, on this site, a new building arose, which was a testimony to faith in Christ and to the determination that he was the way and the truth and the life. Peter of Illyria, a priest from Dalmatia, which is in modern-day Croatia, came to Rome and invested his considerable fortune in building a new basilica, which was to crown the Aventine Hill and to be a symbol of that city set upon a hill, which was a representative of the heavenly Jerusalem. The Dominican order began in the south of France in the early 13th century. It was founded by Dominic, a Spaniard from Castile, who had begun an itinerant preaching mission directed against the Cathar or Albigensian heretics. Very soon he attracted a small band of companions who joined him in trying to implement this program of itinerant preaching. Eventually, his community was confirmed as an official community of the Diocese of Toulouse. But in 1215 everything was to change. In that year, St. Dominic accompanied the Bishop of Toulouse to the General Council of the Church held at Rome, known as the Lateran Council, the Fourth Lateran Council. This was a reforming council initiated by the great legislator Pope Innocent III. And in the legislation of the General Council of the Lateran, Dominic saw the program for a different type of religious order. The legislation of the council insisted on the duty of bishops to preach and to ensure that there should be sound and good preaching in their diocese. Also, it insisted that the faithful should have the opportunity of confessing to their priests at least once a year. Dominic took this vision back to Toulouse, to the members of his community there, and told them that what had started in Toulouse as a small and fairly fragile enterprise was now to be extended throughout the whole of the Roman Church. When St. Dominic returned to Toulouse after the Council of the Lateran, he had some shocking news for his brethren. He told them they were to be dispersed, to split up into small groups, and they were to be sent to different parts of Europe. A small group under the leadership of his brother Manes was sent to Spain, some were sent to Paris and some to Bologna. Now Paris and Bologna were not chosen by chance. They were the centres of the emerging university movement. St. Dominic realised that if his preachers were to be able to preach the truth of Christianity and to witness to the gospel, they had to be learned. They had to have the highest form of education that was available at the time. So he sent them to Paris and to Bologna, the leading universities of the time. But in order for his order to be a universal order, in order to have the authority to preach universally, that is throughout the church, he needed the confirmation and the support of a universal authority. That meant he had to ask the Pope for letters of confirmation, bulls then, which would recommend his preachers to the bishops in the various parts of the world. So in order for the universal order to function, it needed to turn to the universal authority, the universal pastor, the Pope, the Bishop of Rome. And so St. Dominic came to Rome, and that was the beginning of his association with this place. the Basilica and Convent of Santa Sabina. So we're standing now before the main door of the Basilica, which dates from the foundation of the Basilica, that is to say the early 5th century. It's one of the earliest and best preserved examples of any door to a Christian basilica. The panels on the door have been rearranged over the centuries, but they form a commentary on the Old Testament. Scenes from the Old Testament have been placed together with the New Testament to illustrate the story of the redemption. The most interesting panel from the point of view of Christian theology and the history of art is in the top left-hand corner, which is one of the earliest representations of the crucifixion in early Christian art. Normally, Christ was displayed either as the Good Shepherd or as Christ in glory enthroned in majesty with the Book of Life, the Book of the Gospels, in front of him. Here he's depicted on the cross, the suffering Messiah, crucified between two thieves. It's a most unusual representation and one of the earliest ever made in Christian art. In the 13th century, the city of Rome was divided into areas which were controlled by powerful Roman families. This area of the Aventine was dominated by the Savelli family, and they built a fortress here right next to the basilica, whose walls are still standing. But they also incorporated some of the buildings which were attached to Santa Sabina into their fortification. So when the friars arrived, they had to make some adjustments and some changes to these buildings. I'm standing here in front of the ancient door to the priory. This is the door through which St. Dominic and the first generations of the Dominican friars would have passed as they came backwards and forwards about their business in the city of Rome. Above the door, you see a window which leads directly onto the dormitory, which was built above the entrance portico to the basilica. This was the window through which the brother porter looked to see who was asking admittance to the priory. It also tells us that the Aventine at that time was rather a rough and dangerous area. Above the door there is a fresco painted in the 17th century which tells the story of how one evening St. Dominic was coming back very late from seeing the Dominican nuns at San Sisto, their monastery at the bottom of the Aventine Hill. He was very anxious because he was so late, and he thought that all the brothers would be in bed, and he was very anxious not to disturb them. So he prayed, and angels appeared and led him through the rough streets of the Aventine back to the priory, where they opened the door silently, and he was able to return to the priory without waking up any of the brethren, for which I'm sure they were very grateful. So now we are standing in the Basilica of Santa Sabina on the Aventine Hill. It was built by a priest from Dalmatia, which is modern-day Croatia, who was called Peter of Illyria. And he founded the basilica on the foundations of a rich Roman house which dated from the 1st century AD. And some of the ruins of that Roman house, it was very probably destroyed and looted during the sack of Rome in 410, were built into the structures of the walls itself. And you can see one of the columns of the atrium of that house in the wall over there. This column was part of a line of columns which was built into the structure of the basilica, and it surrounded the very large atrium or front courtyard of the rich Roman villa. We don't know too much about the builder of the basilica, Peter of Illyria, except that he must have been a very wealthy man with very good taste. He must have been wealthy in order to be able to afford a building like this. Behind me there is a magnificent tribute to the founder, Peter of Illyria. It refers to him as a priest of the Diocese of Rome who constructed this wonder, as it says in the mosaic, during the reign of Pope Celestine I. But there's also a topical reference in the mosaic to events of the time, particularly to the Council of Ephesus, which took place in 431, at which the Bishop of Rome claimed to be the primate of the whole of the Church. That is to say that he held jurisdiction over all the bishops of the Church. The mosaic itself is a testimony to the unity of the Church and to the triumph of Christianity over the Roman Empire. On the left, we see a figure of the Church of the Circumcision, the Church of the Jewish tradition, in the shape of a woman clothed in very somber garments. She holds open a copy of the Old Testament. On the right, we see the Church of the Gentiles, the Church of the nations. And this woman, clothed in a similar fashion to the woman who represents the Old Covenant, holds open a book of the New Testament. And this is a testimony to the unity of the Church, uniting the Old and the New Covenants. The frieze above the columns of the basilica dates from the foundation of the church, and it's made of fine marble and porphyry. It was a considerable investment at the time, and it makes a political and religious statement. What's the political and religious statement? Well, if you see the designs, which many people think look like chalices and hosts, they are in fact Roman cavalry standards, and they are surmounted by the cross. And this symbolizes the triumph of Christianity, the triumph of the cross over the forces of the Roman Empire, the pagan forces of the Roman Empire. In early Christian times, it was forbidden for Christians to serve in the Roman army, because to join the army meant taking an oath, which was a religious ceremony, under the pagan standards. So this is a sign that now there is a harmony, a unity between the church and the empire, that the empire has become a Christian state. We're standing now in the room which is above the entrance portico of the Basilica of Santa Sabina. It was this that the early friars transformed into their dormitory. As you can see, it's much changed from those days. Now it has become the Museum of Santa Sabina. Behind me here, we have one of the earliest representations of St. Dominic in marble. It was found not very long ago, having been concealed for several hundred years. It's believed to form part of the baldacchino or canopy which was over the high altar of the basilica. And it shows St. Dominic holding the book of the Gospels. He's pointing to the Gospels as the way, the truth, and the life. Being a preacher of the word, all of his life and all of his preaching activity was evangelical, founded on the gospel. There are some interesting little details here. You see this little marble chip decoration here, which was a speciality of Italy at that time. It's known as cosmatesque or cosmati work, named after the brothers Cosmati, who invented it. And very soon it spread all over Europe, even as far as Westminster Abbey, where the king, making a shrine to his sainted predecessor, Edward the Confessor, employed the Cosmati brothers and their workers to embellish the tomb with this kind of decoration. Here we have one of the earliest pictures in the possession of the Dominican order here at Santa Sabina. It dates from the 13th century, almost from the lifetime of St. Dominic himself. And again, it tells the story of one of the legends to be found in the Lives of the Brethren, which is a collection of stories and legends associated with St. Dominic and the early friars. It tells the story of how one day St. Dominic arrived at one of the priories and there was no bread for the brethren to eat. At that time, they depended on alms or the gifts of the people of God. So they usually had nothing in reserve and lived from day to day, putting into practice that petition which we make in the Our Father, "Give us this day our daily bread." Well, on this particular day, they had no daily bread. So St. Dominic prayed, and his good friends, the angels, who we've seen above the door to the priory, came to his assistance, and there was a miraculous supply of bread. So this painting, very simple, tells the story of that legend. Santa Sabina was the residence of the masters of the order until the middle of the 13th century, when the master, together with his council, moved to the Dominican priory in the center of Rome, Santa Maria sopra Minerva, near the Pantheon. It was much easier for them to keep contact with the papal court from the center of the city. Santa Sabina then became an ordinary priory, living the ordinary Dominican life without an attachment to the central administration of the order. In the 14th century, a great cataclysm spread over Europe in the shape of the Great Plague, which appears to have been a strain of the bubonic plague. It wiped out a large percentage of the population, including many members of religious orders, who were amongst the first to fall because of their involvement with the care of the sick and the dying. As a consequence, a general kind of laxness spread over certain religious orders, and movements for reform appeared within them. It was the same for the Dominican order. Raymond of Capua, who subsequently became master of the order, who was a confessor and friend of Catherine of Siena, started a movement for Dominican reform, a return to the observance of the primitive or the earliest constitutions. And what happened was that various priories banded together and formed what were called congregations. So Santa Sabina became one of the members of these reformed congregations. It gave new life and new direction to the order. Santa Sabina was a very significant center of Dominican reform, and many important figures in ecclesiastical life were members of its community. Amongst the most famous, perhaps, is Michele Ghislieri, who joined the order at 14 and in 1566 was elected pope. He lived a very austere life and was always attached to the forms of Dominican life and observance. He had a great affection for his former community, which was Santa Sabina. He was so attached, in fact, that he came here to live for various parts of the year. And this was his cell. It didn't look like this, of course, when he lived in it. It was a simple cell like that of any other friar. He came here for the summers and for periods of retreat. But one of his successors, Pope Clement IX, transformed his cell into a chapel because he wished to promote devotion to the memory of Pius V. The lifestyle of the early friars was very simple. They prayed together, they ate together, and they slept in a common dormitory. St. Dominic, as master of the order, had his own cell or his own private room, which was a place for study, for prayer, and for solitude. When the building was reconstructed in the 16th century, such was the devotion to the memory of St. Dominic that his cell was kept substantially as we see it now. It probably hasn't changed very much from the cell that he himself knew. Although he had a cell, stories about him tell us that he didn't use it very much, especially during the night, because witnesses at his canonization say that he was constant in prayer. He was always at prayer, especially at night. Here in Santa Sabina, he used to spend the night in prayer, lying on the floor of the basilica, on the marble slab which marked the first resting place or shrine to the early Christian martyrs, whose relics were brought here to Santa Sabina before the 10th century. The dimensions of St. Dominic's cell, as you can see, are very modest. They seem to correspond to the dimensions of the original cells in the first Dominican community in Toulouse. So it looks as if there was a regular pattern which St. Dominic wanted followed in all of the priories which were built during his lifetime. It was illuminated by a little window, which you can see behind me. The window now looks out onto the cloister because the building has been reconstructed. In the 17th century, Pope Clement IX wanted to increase devotion to the memory of St. Dominic. And Pope Clement was himself very attached to the spirit of the order. He too used to come to Santa Sabina, like his predecessor, Pius V, for periods of retreat and recollection. So it was he who turned the entrance to the chapel into this highly decorated example of 17th century art. So the Dominican order had an unusual, in fact a revolutionary, political constitution. Every member of the order, every brother, was linked by a personal vow of obedience to the master of the order. So he was the overall head. So in theory, every brother could be moved to any part of the order that the master wished. But the order was divided into smaller units called provinces, and the provinces were divided into priories or convents. So the fundamental unit of government was the priory. A universal order needed a fairly tight legislative structure, and the Dominican tradition was always to search for consensus based on dialogue, a certain degree of attentiveness to the brothers in the community. In every Dominican community, there would have been a room like this. It's called the chapter room. It's called the chapter room because traditionally a chapter of the rule was read here before many of the proceedings. It was also here that the brothers met to discuss the material, the financial aspects of the house, as well as the direction and shape which their apostolate and mission should take. It was here, just after Easter in 1220, that St. Dominic gave the religious habit of the Dominican order to a group of university students. Two young Polish men, Jacek, known today as Hyacinth, the Latin form of his name, and his brother Czesław, who were Polish. Together with them was Herman from Germany and a brother Henry of Moravia. The chapter room has changed for a little since St. Dominic's time. The roof is much higher than it was, but the dimensions are the same. And it was on that spot there that the Dominican province of Poland began. St. Dominic wished his order to be a learned order. An order of preachers must also be an order of doctors. So the principal places which the brothers went to in order to make foundations were those university cities. And it was from there that they recruited large numbers of students who were eager for this new evangelical apostolic form of life, which combined elements of monasticism with the mission of preaching the gospel. So here, in Santa Sabina, once more, this movement for renewal and reform of the church can be seen. Santa Sabina has risen above the Roman landscape for over 1,500 years. For almost 800 of those years, it has sheltered a Dominican community devoted to the study and to the preaching of the Word of God and to witnessing to that Word by the character and quality of their lives. Many illustrious and famous friars have passed through these doors. It has been the dwelling place of popes, Benedict XI, Benedict XIII, Pius V. It has sheltered missionaries. It has inspired generations of friars to follow in the apostolic way of life according to the pattern of St. Dominic. Some to martyrdom, some to other forms of life, which though obscure, have been powerful in their witness to St. Dominic and to the message of Jesus Christ. Following the example of all of those who've gone before us, we who live here at Santa Sabina in the service of the Order and the Church attempt to continue to proclaim what we read in the first letter of St. John. What we have seen, what we have heard, what we have touched with our hands, the Word who is life, so that you may have fellowship with us.